to have in our tool belt. The other term underneath here is the discriminant. The discriminant tells us how many solutions a function should have, or a quadratic equation should have. And also if they're real or imaginary. So the discriminant, by finding this value, we would know if we have two real solutions or if we have two imaginary solutions, or if we would only have one real solution. So those would be our options, either two real, two imaginary, or one real solution. And by finding this discriminant and using that number without even kind of looking at a graph of a parabola, it would explain how many answers the equation has. There's always at most two because it's x squared. So we got that parabola, the left and the right could have at most two answers. But there might be two real or two imaginary answers depending on the numbers in the problem. So in the little, I guess it's not a box, but underneath, the quadratic formula says let a, b, and c be real numbers. So that's the numbers with our quadratic equation, that ax squared plus bx plus c. Those are the a, b, and c values. So the quadratic formula is a way to solve a quadratic equation. So an equation has an equal sign. We're solving for a quadratic equation. A formula is a process that we can use for that. The formula says take negative b, and then we have a plus or a minus because there's a square root involved in it. And anytime there's a square root involved, to solve for something, we have that plus or minus. Then it's b squared minus 4 times a and c. All of this is divided by 2 times a. So I know it looks like a pretty big formula because there's a couple of different terms that we're going to be looking at. The a, b, and c come from the numbers that are in the equation. And I think after you've worked through this 3 or 4 times, you'll have it memorized pretty quickly. So this is a way to solve an equation that can't be factored, that completing the square gets messy because there's fractions involved. So then we have this as an option to use. So if you look underneath, it wants us to use the quadratic formula to solve the equation. And it says there's going to be two real solutions. So the first thing when you're solving any equation, it must equal 0. And that's because of the zero product property. So if we're trying to solve an equation using factoring, using the quadratic formula, we need to make sure that equation is equal to 0. So we're going to take that 6 to the other side because we need to have our a, b, and c values be on the same side of the equation. So we now have 1x squared plus 7x minus 6. I'm going to write this again here just to visually see it. I know you have it right above on your notes. So the quadratic formula works as a method we could use instead of completing the square. Because if we completed the square, we would take b, which is 7, and divide it by 2. So now we have 7 halves, and we would square that, which we would get a horrible fraction. So instead of having a horrible fraction, we just try and plug some numbers into this formula. So you have a lot of formulas in science that you'll use. We have a formula in math that we're using here. B, right here's b, that's 7. So we have a negative 7, and then a plus or a minus. That plus or minus is there because there's a square root in this equation. And then it says take b squared, so 7 squared, minus 4. That 4 is just part of the formula. And then a is 1, and c is negative 6. On the bottom, the 2 is part of the formula. And then there's an A on the bottom, and that A is the value of 1. So I know it's a lot of numbers to plug in, and I call this a plug-and-chug formula. So you plug the numbers in, and then you look underneath the square root, and let's see if we can use the numbers underneath the square root. So we have 7 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6. You can put that all in your calculator in one step. So, but you just want the number underneath the square root. Don't put the square root in your calculator. So you're just doing 7 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 6. Or if you don't need your calculator and use that mental math, that would be awesome too. Either way. So what number goes underneath the square root? Patty? 73. So we have negative 7 plus or minus, the square root is 73, and the bottom is 2 times 1, which is 2. Can you break down the square root of 73? Because we're dealing with square roots, we still have to think about trying to break them down. Do you think 73 can be broken down? No, 73 is prime. So this is actually what our answer looks like. And it doesn't look like much of an answer, because it isn't a nice number. But that would be the exact solution where the x-intercepts are. Now, yes, we could find decimal values, because that's probably what you would think would be a better answer. But this will be an exact answer where the x-intercepts would be an exact solution. So completing the square, we could have gotten this number, but it would have been pretty messy, like that 45/4 that we had in that last problem that we did from the homework. So if you look at the next one, it says solve the equation now with one real solution. So we're just trying to work to show you how you can get different answers using this quadratic equation, quadratic formula. So we're still going to use negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. When you plug in a negative 30 into a negative b, be careful, that becomes a positive 30. So it's already negative, and then we're plugging a negative number in place of it. So now it's positive 30. We have negative 30 squared minus 4 times 25 times 9. And on the bottom, 2 times 25. What number do you get underneath the square root? Jillian. 0. And Jillian on the bottom is 2 times a, or 2 times 25, so that makes 50. What's the square root of 0, Jillian? 0. So this says that we have 30 plus or minus 0, because the square root of 0 is 0. So we wouldn't write plus or minus 0, and then divided by 50. Because again, why would we write plus or minus 0? It's nothing there. We wouldn't want to write that value. Julian, does that reduce at all? To 3/5. So here's an option or a case where we have one solution, and that one solution is 3/5. And that's because we got a square root of 0 underneath. Any questions with that second example? So the third option would be if we could have imaginary solutions. So you either have two real, one real answer that turns out pretty nice, or we could have some imaginary values. So that means we might have something going on underneath that square root. Again, check to see this first problem on the right side here is a positive 5. So make sure it's equal to 0 if we're going to try and use the quadratic formula. So underneath we have 2 squared minus 4 times -1 times -5. So what number is underneath our square root this time? Emma, what number do you get underneath this square root? -16. Emma, what is the square root of -16? Right. So the negative gives us the I. So this negative comes out and becomes an I. The square root of 16 is 4. And then we need to try and reduce this because it says we're dividing by -2. So we have currently x equals 2 plus or minus 4i, and then dividing by -2. What do you think? Yes, thank you. I missed the negative sign there. Yep, you're right. So this should be a -2 right here. Thanks. So right here, I missed my negative sign. Thanks, Adette. -b, so -2. All right, so we're going to try and reduce this because we're dividing by -2, and on the top we have numbers that we can divide with. I call this crisscross applesauce. So when you reduce a fraction, you're going to reduce it the one way. So we're going to criss and then cross. So we have -2 divided by -2. -2 divided by -2 is +1, so that's my criss. And then we're going to cross. We have that plus or minus, and then we have plus or minus 4i divided by -2. Because that plus or minus is there, when you're dividing by a negative number, it's not really changing a plus or a minus option, because either way, you're still going to have a positive or a negative option. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and then we still have that I there. So when you're reducing a fraction, you're crissing and crossing when there are two numbers up on the top of the fraction. But both of them have to be affected by that -2 in the denominator. So this solution is imaginary, and that solution is 1 plus or minus 2i. Questions? So the last thing that we're going to look at is something called the discriminant. The discriminant is just a small piece of the quadratic equation, and the discriminant is that b squared minus 4ac part, the part that's underneath the quadratic formula. So it's not an extra piece, it's just the part that's underneath the square root in the formula. That piece tells us that if the number underneath the square root is bigger than 0, then we'll have two real answers, which was the first example that we just went over. So the first example, we had a number of the square root of 73. That 73 is bigger than 0, so we have two answers. This is what the parabola would look like if there's two answers. Anytime we find solutions of a parabola, we're really finding x-intercepts when we're solving for x. If the square root is equal to 0, like the second example when we had the square root of 0, we have one answer, and that one answer is because the vertex is touching the x-axis where the solution is. And then the last option was when we had that imaginary answer, just like we just did here, that 1 plus or minus 2i. That happens because there's a negative number underneath the square root. So here we have a positive number. Here it's equal to 0, and over here we're going to have a negative number. We have no solutions because the graph is above the x-axis. So a solution is when a graph touches an x-axis. That's what we're really solving for when we're finding x. Where is the graph crossing the x-axis? So if it doesn't cross the x-axis, then there's not a solution to the graph. There's not a solution for x. So those would be the three options that we have to look at. So underneath, there's a little chart. we have 3 problems, and then you have a little chart underneath that wants us to kind of work through the 3 problems. So we're going to find the discriminant first of all of them, just to see what the discriminant does. And then we might have time to get the actual solutions, but we'll see if we can use the discriminant part. So in the first problem, we have x squared plus 6x plus 5. So here's our first one, x squared plus 6x plus 5. The discriminant is just the part that's underneath the square root, and that tells us how many solutions and the type of solution that we would have. So we're finding b squared, which is 6, minus 4 times a times c. So we're going to calculate that number. That number will then say we have 2 or we have 1. It's real or it's imaginary. And in this case, 6 squared, which is 36, minus 20 gives us 16. So 16 is the discriminant. Julia, does that discriminant tell us there are 2 real, 2 imaginary, or 1 real solution?
2 real.
Yeah, so this is positive. It's greater than 0. So that means we have 2 real solutions. And then we can find them using the quadratic formula. But you now already have the square root of 16. So you already have part of the quadratic formula done when you find the discriminant. So looking at the second one, we have x squared plus 6x plus 9. So this one is x squared plus 6x plus 9. So we still have 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9. What's that equal to? 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 9. Julian? 0. Julian, if it's equal to 0, how many solutions do we have? 1 real solution. So we're going to just get one answer, and it's going to be a nice answer, like a fraction of 3/5, or just a whole number of 2. But that one's going to be a nice answer there. And then the last one they gave us up here, we have x squared plus 6x plus 13. So the discriminant, we have 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 13. The discriminant is really just finding that little piece of the quadratic formula. Abby, what number did you get there?
Negative 16.
Negative 16. So what does negative 16 tell us about our solution, Abby?
It's imaginary.
Right, we have 2 imaginary solutions. So again, we would continue to solve, could continue to solve, because now you have that number that's underneath the square root. So we already have this middle piece here, and we would just kind of finish the problem. We would take the negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 16 divided by 2 times 1 to get our answer. So I have a worksheet that I'm going to give out again today. The assignment sheet I kind of tweaked a little bit, so instead of doing the worksheet that's on the assignment sheet, if you're kind of looking at that, this is slightly different than that's listed on the assignment sheet. So we're looking at 1 to 25 odd on this page. The first group of problems, you're only finding the discriminant, just that number underneath the radical of b squared minus 4ac. Everybody get one? The second part, again, you're only finding the discriminant, but then you're saying how many solutions it has. The third part is where you're actually using the quadratic formula. And again, you're doing 1 to 25 odd. And I think you could probably fit them on this worksheet. Just the 1 to 25 odd. Are there questions? So just kind of looking to next week, On Monday, we'll have your notebook quiz for chapters 3 and 4. So Monday will be the notebook quiz for chapters 3 and 4. So make sure that you kind of have all your homework assignments organized, all your notes in there. Make sure you got all the notes that we've taken. And then Tuesday is your chapter 4 test, which we'll start reviewing for on Friday. So we'll review on Friday. We'll have some time in class to review on Monday as well. And then we have the notebook quiz, which will be about 20-25 minutes. Questions?